So here in Rochester, Minnesota, where I live, there's an ice cream place called Flapdoodles, and I really like it because not only is the ice cream amazing, it's also the only ice cream shop I've ever been to where there's a quote from Aristotle on the walls. The people who own Flapdoodles actually really love sailing, and so that means that everything on the menu is nautically themed. If you want one scoop of ice cream, you can get it in a bowl with a cone on top, and it's called a flapdoodle. It's supposed to look like a little sailboat. But if that's not what you want, if you want a little bit more, you can get a flabbermast. That's 2 scoops of ice cream. Or you can get a flagship, 3 scoops of ice cream in a little boat-shaped dish with little cones for sails on top. But if that's not enough, if you're feeling ambitious, and I mean throw caution to the wind, do what makes you feel good, YOLO ambitious, there's another option. And that option is called the Fleet. It's not a flapdoodle, it's not a flabbermast, it's not a flagship. It's all 3. It is 6 scoops of ice cream for you to eat and enjoy. And you may be asking yourself, why on earth would anybody do this? And the answer to whether or not somebody would eat an entire fleet by themselves seems to come down to a really basic question. A question of like, would that make you feel good? Maybe you just really love ice cream and you cannot wait to sink your teeth into 6 scoops of ice cream with little cones on top. Or maybe you think that's not for me because, oh my God, that would make me sick and I would throw up and I absolutely don't want to do that. Or maybe you would just think well, I'm trying to watch what I eat, and if I get this and if I eat it, I'm going to have to eat celery for the next 2 weeks and, just sort of count me out. And what all of these answers have in common, whether you would want to eat a fleet or not, seems to be basically, would doing this make me feel good? And that question, that idea of doing what makes you feel good, is the main idea behind hedonism. At its most basic level, hedonism is really straightforward. We should want to maximize the amount of happiness that we have in our lives, and we should want to minimize the amount of unhappiness in our lives. In fact, one of the most common ways that hedonism is thought of comes from a Scottish philosopher named John Stuart Mill. And John Stuart Mill put it this way. He has something he calls the greatest happiness principle. Actions are right in proportion as they tend to promote happiness, wrong as they tend to produce the reverse of happiness. By happiness is intended pleasure in the absence of pain, by unhappiness, pain, and the privation of pleasure. So basically, the hedonist thinks that everything in the world can be divided into one of 3 categories. The first category is the intrinsic good of happiness. We have things in the world that simply do make us happy, and they are valuable simply for that reason. The second thing that we have is we have instrumental goods, things that aren't necessarily happiness, but we value them because they ultimately lead to happiness. And the third thing that we have are things that either aren't valuable at all, or in fact they're actually bad because they either don't contribute to happiness at all, or worse, contribute to pain and unhappiness. But wait a minute, you think. It seems like there's all kinds of things in the world that seem good. They maybe even seem intrinsically good, but they're not happiness, like truth and justice and beauty and things like that. And the hedonist has a really interesting and important answer to that claim. The hedonist is never going to say, oh no, we shouldn't care about beauty or we shouldn't care about justice or things like that. What the hedonist is going to say is, actually, if you think about it, you're misunderstanding why you value these things. Either what you're thinking about really is just happiness by another name. For example, when you experience a beautiful landscape or a beautiful painting or a piece of beautiful music, really what you're experiencing is a form of happiness when you stop and think about it. And so when we say something is beautiful and something is valuable because it's beautiful, what we're really saying is this is a way in which I experience happiness. Or when you say something like justice is good, it's actually instrumentally good. You just don't really realize that it's instrumentally good. For example, we value justice, but maybe we value justice because we think that generally speaking, we're going to be happier in a just society, or seeing people get what they deserve just sort of makes us happy. If the hedonist is right, then what we should do is we should pursue the thing that makes us happiest. And the question that we want to ask ourselves is, what exactly is that? And the answer is going to differ from philosopher to philosopher, from person to person. Mill, for example, thought that pleasures were all good, but there were some pleasures that were sort of higher than others. Mill thought that there were intellectual pleasures that were actually better than physical or sensual pleasures. It was better to get a good education and read a really good book than to, get drunk every day or something like that. Another really fascinating answer comes to us from the ancient Greek philosopher Epicurus, who was a hedonist, but he was also not a hedonist who thought that we should just, blindly spend our lives in pursuit of pleasure. And the reason he thought this was because he thought that at some point in our lives, we were going to experience pain. We were going to experience difficulty. And the best way for us to overcome those difficult times, sort of like what we're experiencing right now with pandemics and social distancing and all of that, would be to avoid circumstances where we would end up missing these sorts of luxuries. And so the thing that we should do is actually live a simple, straightforward life, because we would be avoiding pain during that time. We would get to experience simple pleasures. And then when the hard times actually came around, we wouldn't actually have to suffer as much as we normally would. Now, this sounds like a really interesting theory. One of the great things about hedonism is that happiness and pleasure seem like sort of obvious intrinsic goods in a way that other things don't necessarily seem to be intrinsically good, or at least like obviously so. But it's not clear that hedonism just is the right answer. We should just all be hedonists and move on with our lives, move on with the next step in our sort of philosophical investigations. There are some important reasons why maybe you don't want to be a hedonist. One of the most important reasons why you might not want to be a hedonist has to do with this idea of sorting out what the most important pleasures are. So Epicurus has this theory that says that, it's really just happiness, and it doesn't matter where the happiness or pleasure comes from. We sort of pragmatically want to avoid luxuries because when the hard times come, they won't be so hard on us. But other hedonists thought that there were higher and lower pleasures. Again, Mill thought that intellectual pleasures were better than physical pleasures. Or maybe you might be worried that, there are some pleasures that seem sort of obviously out of bounds. It might be fine for me to enjoy a really nice meal, but it seems sort of obviously wrong for me to take pleasure from torturing kittens or something like that. But whether you're worried about, people who take pleasure from torturing kittens, or whether you're Mill and you sit back and you think no, there are higher and lower pleasures, you face this really difficult question where you have to be able to defend why that's the case without appealing to any other intrinsic good than happiness or pleasure. Because the instant you stop saying that happiness or pleasure are the only intrinsic goods, you stop being a hedonist. And the difficulty is, it's not really clear how we can do that. For example, if I just really, really enjoy torturing kittens, and you come to me and you say well, the kittens have rights, or it's just wrong to torture kittens, or, God will be very upset with you if you torture kittens or something like that. If I just say, well, no, it makes me really happy and that's what I want to do, it seems like the hedonist might have to accept the idea that, for me, torturing kittens is good. Or if Mill comes to me and says, Jake, you should really read a good book. And I say no, I'm just going to sit around and get drunk. He has to be able to tell me why reading a book is better than getting drunk. And it seems without being able to appeal to the fact that there's some good other than just feeling good, if I come back and say no, just getting drunk just really makes me happier than reading a book, it seems like Mill just sort of has to accept that. And that may not be the greatest thing ever. The second reason that you might want to avoid hedonism, the second concern that you might have, actually has to do with the experiences themselves. One thing that we think is important, at least in a lot of contexts, is the idea of genuineness or authenticity. And what I mean by that is we seem to think that it's better to have a real experience than it is to have a simulated experience, or have an experience that it turns out was a lie the entire time. So, for example, if I'm playing a game and it's really difficult and I manage to, beat all my friends at the game, I might feel really good about that. But if later on I find out that actually my friends felt sort of bad for me and they let me win, then it seems like I lost out on that experience somehow. And it seems like if I never actually find out that my friends let me win, if I just go around believing that I finally did it and I beat all my friends at the game, but actually it was only because they let me win, it seems like that's somehow, in some important sense, worse than if I had actually genuinely managed to do it. Or, if you think about all of these science fiction examples where people can have false memories implanted, and you can have the experience of climbing Mount Everest. And this is where hedonism seems to run into a problem, because it seems like my experience is better or worse depending on whether or not it's actually authentic, whether or not it's actually genuine. And it doesn't matter whether I'm happier or unhappier. If I never find out that my memory of climbing Mount Everest is fake, that doesn't seem to matter. If I never find out that my friends let me win at the game, that doesn't seem to matter. It seems like at a certain level, my experience is worse off if it's not genuine, no matter how happy or unhappy I end up being. So what is hedonism in the end? Hedonism is a theory of value. It is a theory that says that there is only one intrinsic good, and that intrinsic good is happiness. We should pursue happiness in our lives, and we should avoid pain. We should avoid unhappiness. Why be a hedonist? The answer is pretty straightforward, honestly. Happiness is obviously an intrinsic good. It's an intrinsic good that seems to be so clear in a way that other goods that may be intrinsic aren't. It's hard to identify any other obvious intrinsic goods. And if that's the case, let's just be hedonists. Why not be a hedonist? Again, a couple really powerful reasons. Number one, it may be the case that, there are some pleasures, there are some things that make us happy that are just horrible and we shouldn't do them. And the hedonist has a really hard time telling us why that's the case. Also, it seems like authenticity and genuineness are really important parts of our experiences. And if we want to take authenticity and genuineness to be an intrinsic good, then it seems like we can't boil that down to happiness. And if that's the case, we can't be hedonists anymore. Does this mean we should or shouldn't be a hedonist? Well, I'm not going to say that, because we have other theories of happiness and other theories of value to look at as we go through these videos. But for now, certainly something to think about. And we're going to think about some other theories of value next time.